Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 83 of How I Built It. In today's episode, I talked to Scott DeLuzio about one of this summer's hottest topics, GDPR. Scott and I spoke about this just days before the regulation took effect. So we were working through what it is and how it affects us, and of course, how his plugin can help. I should remind you that we are not lawyers, and if you have serious GDPR concerns, you should talk to a lawyer. But if you're just generally interested in what it is, and you should be, then this episode's for you. We go over some great tools, and of course, Scott talks about how his plugin can help us. This episode is brought to you by Pantheon and MailPoet, who you'll hear about a little bit later. But for now, on with the show. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of How I Built It, the podcast that asks, how did you build that? Today, my guest is Scott DeLuzio, and Scott, I'm going to let you introduce yourself because I know you have a few different things, and you've been associated with the show before. So first of all, Scott, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. So my name is Scott DeLuzio. I started developing plugins for WordPress really as a way to scratch my own itch. And I've been listening to the show for a while, and I know that I'm not quite alone there. I know that a lot of other people have done that. But in doing that, I kind of got pretty good at solving problems. So when I'd be at WordCamps or meetups and things like that, talking to people about the problems they were having, I'd start thinking of ways to solve their problems or realize, that's something I've had a problem with too. And so I'd start to come up with ways to solve their problems in addition to my own problems. So over the last few years, I have 15 plugins on WordPress.org, and I have another 5 premium products that I sell, including one of which that we'll be talking about today. So.
Wow, that's great. And I know that when we were, scheduling you to be on the show, we talked about, do you want to talk about WP System, which is one of your plugins that you've advertised on the show?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you've acquired a plugin from Pippin, and then we settled on this one about the GDPR, right?
Correct. Yeah. So basically, I have the 5 premium products that I sell. So you mentioned a couple. WP System is basically a CRM that's baked inside of WordPress. So all of your contact data and everything like that is all stored inside of WordPress. Same idea as why you want to host your own site as opposed to using a third-party system is you have control over your data. Full screen background images is a plugin that you mentioned that I acquired from Pippin. That was just a couple months ago, back in end of February or so. It's now late May, so a few months ago there. I have conditional checkout fields, which is a plugin for WooCommerce or easy digital downloads, which allows you to add checkout fields to the checkout page, depending on the products that are in the customer's cart. So you can collect extra information if you need it. And I have WP 1099 is a plugin that allows you to basically export 1099 information for tax purposes at the end of the year from affiliates, or if you have like a multi-vendor marketplace when you need to issue a 1099 to those people. I have that plugin as well. And then the plugin we'll be talking about today is called Privacy WP, and we'll get into more about that later on. But as you mentioned, it's kind of has something to do with the GDPR and things like that.
Gotcha. Yeah, wow, I didn't realize that you did WP 1099. So you tackle some pretty hard topics as far as running a business in the WordPress space goes, right? You're running a CRM and issuing 1099s, which I've never done before. I don't think I've ever paid anybody enough to issue a 1099 to them, like as a contractor, right?
Sure, yeah.
So that's a whole other conversation we can have, but we only have a half hour, and this is going to be information packed. Privacy WP has to do with the GDPR. So let's start with defining the GDPR and then how you came up with the idea.
Yeah, sure. So the GDPR is a regulation coming out of the European Union that basically revolves around privacy. And just kind of as a disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. And Joe, I know you're not a lawyer as well.
Yeah.
So none of the stuff that we're talking about here is legal advice or anything like that. But basically, it's regulations that kind of revolve around privacy, basically giving the control back to the individual in terms of what data companies can store on them and how they can use that data, how they're able to collect the data, and what they can do with it once they have that data, and things like that. A couple of the key aspects of it that Privacy WP kind of hits on is that it will, one of the things that you need to be able to do is to export data and give that to the individual so that they can see what kind of information you have, on them. And then if they choose to have all that data be erased from your system, you need to be able to do that as well. And that's something that Privacy WP kind of touched on as well. So that's kind of the gist of the GDPR. Definitely not the legal definition of what it is or anything like that. If you need more information on that, there's plenty of resources out there, or you can always talk to a lawyer who certainly would have more information than I would be able to give you.
Yeah, absolutely. And just in case it wasn't clear when I said it, as Scott was talking, I'm also not a lawyer, so definitely don't consider this legal advice. But I know a lot of people are very worried about it. It's, as we record this, it's May 21st. May 25th is the day that it goes into effect in the European Union. I know a lot of people at this point are wondering a couple of things, right? What do I need to do to get GDPR compliant? Why do I even need to become GDPR compliant if I'm located in the United States? And a whole bunch of stuff like that. And your plugin, I suspect, revolves around some of the latest updates from 4.9.6. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's definitely accurate. So, like you mentioned, there's been some updates to WordPress in the most recent version, which is 4.9.6. And what it basically allows you to do is allows you to enter in somebody's email address or their username on your site. It allows you to go and enter that email address and generate an export file of all the data that you have for that individual on your website, or be able to erase that data from that individual. So, for example, if you have comments open on your site or an e-commerce plugin, this feature in WordPress will include any of that data that's stored on your site for the individual, like the comments or orders or things like that. WordPress core data is included in the export by default. However, data from plugins needs to be added in. So WooCommerce, for example, would have to code a solution for including order information in that export. Since my other plugin, WP CRM system, is very heavily involved with user data, I started working with these features long before they were released to make sure that my plugin was going to be able to work with them correctly. But I got to thinking that the only way these tools will be able to export or erase data is if we tell it to. And that's fine for plugins like mine or WooCommerce or things like that, but not all data is stored on our websites. And so, ideally we'd have all of our data housed under one roof, so that way it makes life a whole lot easier. But we've come to rely on third-party apps for things like newsletters and CRMs and payment gateways and a number of other things like that. And so I figured there ought to be a way to include some of that data in the export or erase requests that are built into WordPress. Otherwise, users are going to be scrambling to download data from a dozen different sites and trying to, format it in a way that they can send it to people, either through email or some other way. And so that's basically what Privacy WP does, is it allows you to hook into a number of different third-party services or apps that will let you include that data that they have in the export or erase requests. So, for example, like MailChimp, your email newsletter, will have you'll be able to get your subscriber information, sent into this built-in solution that in WordPress, but it basically is pulling that data from the third-party service.
Wow, so that's really interesting, right? So I connect, I've connected MailChimp, I've connected ConvertKit and stuff like that, other third-party systems, and I also have plugins like LearnDash, which is an LMS, right? There's a bit of student data in there, and I guess we're talking about data, right? But I think the distinction is personally identifiable information, right? So
right.
I can have like student X completed this course, and that's not personally identifiable information unless I actually have the user's name completed this course, right? So I can keep the data on like completion rates. I can say like 14 students of 20 students completed this course, as long as I don't have the student's name or email or IP address associated with it, right?
Right. And basically, like, if any information can be tied back to an individual by itself or in combination with something else. So let's say, for example, that only one student has ever completed your course. You might be able to tie the fact that that student completed like if
Right.
if you know that I completed your course, you'd be able to tie back, okay, well that's Scott and whatever. So you'd be able to tie that back to me at some point. But if you had 1,000 people taking your course and you have a completion rate of, 25%, you're probably not going to be able to tie that back to any one individual. So I guess each use case is going to kind of be, and that's why you need a lawyer, is because
Right.
each
Yeah.
use case is going to be different,
That's really interesting, right? If one person ever buys my course, any information I have about that course can be tied back to the user technically, right? Even if I delete all their information from it.
Yes. Yes.
This episode is brought to you by Pantheon. WordPress 5.0 and the new editor, Gutenberg, are coming. Are you prepared? Do you want to learn about the changes in advance? Pantheon has gathered resources to help you prepare, including webinars and tutorials. Pantheon has also made it easy and free for you to try Gutenberg with your site before the official launch. That's right, you can get a free account by heading over to pantheon.io/Gutenberg. Let them know that How I Built It sent you. And now, back to the show. So that's very interesting, and a giant pain in the neck. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about how you built this. It sounds like you're talking to a lot of APIs and stuff like that. You're a developer, obviously. So let's get a little bit developer-y. How did you build Privacy WP?
Yeah, so all of this is really new. So it's even the tools that are built into WordPress is new. It's just, I think last Thursday or Friday or something like that, it came out. So, and they were only introduced in like the beta versions of WordPress just a couple weeks before. So it's pretty new. So a lot of it I had to do kind of trial and error because there wasn't even really a whole lot in terms of documentation with any of this stuff. So I kind of had to dig through code and figure out how I was going to build it. And so it was a lot of trial and error work until some sort of documentation slowly started coming about, from this stuff. But even with that, there were different iterations of the code that in WordPress that I had to kind of adjust what I was doing and kind of reset there. Sort of a side note to that point is if any other developers, plugin developers, whatever, are looking to add these sort of privacy features into their plugins, I do have a blog post on my site, scottdeluzio.com, that shows how to feed the data into the export and erase features that are included in WordPress. So it's a useful resource if you're struggling to figure it out. You can kind of copy and paste the code example and replace your data with whatever the example has in there. So, but that's sort of a side note, not really what we're talking about. I've also been digging into the API documentation for a bunch of different services, which is sort of time consuming, but it's also good to see how the different APIs interact with the services and how you can pull data, what data is available and stuff like that. Some APIs are like Stripe are way easier to use than others. I love working with Stripe just because it's a dream to work with, but others not so much, and they take a little bit longer. But I think it's worth it to have a more complete feature set in terms of the different services that we are gonna interact with, so that way it becomes more useful for people.
Gotcha. Yeah, absolutely. So let's get a high level overview exactly of how this works, right? Because it's still being worked on. It's very new at the time of this recording, but
sure.
Ideally, right, we log into WordPress. WordPress has some built-in features. I'll link to how to access those features, but we enable your plugin. We see a screen where we can connect different services. Is that, or do we have like a report of all the PPI that we have? PII?
Well, so this plugin is basically going to be taking data from third-party sources. So none of it is really going to be stored on your website at the time of installing the plugin. As a matter of fact, the plugin's not going to store any of the data on your website at all. And so what it will do is you're going to have one like settings screen that's going to have a bunch of fields for API keys or different settings like that you might need to access these different services. And so I made the plugin to basically house all of the different integrations. So it's really just a one plugin as opposed to one for MailChimp and one for Stripe and whatever. So you have one plugin that will have all of these services kind of built into it. You fill in the API keys for the applicable services. So if you're only using MailChimp, you just fill in MailChimp's API keys. And then that's, as far as the settings go, that's all you really need to do. Then you go over to WordPress's the export and erase tools that you said you're going to link to.
Yeah.
And you basically, so let's say you came to me and you said, I want to see all the data that you have on me. You give me your email address and I fill it into the box in WordPress in their tool. And I click the, generate export file, or I forget exactly what the language is on that, but generate the export file. And it'll send you basically a simple HTML page that is like a table of all the data from all the various sources. So between all the plugins on your site that incorporate with these privacy tools, WordPress itself, like the comments that you've left on the site, or if you have a user account on the site, or if you've placed any orders through like WooCommerce or Easy Digital Downloads, things like that, it'll all kind of pull in from there. Then my plugin will say, okay, what API keys have been entered in? So like MailChimp, for example. And then it'll say, okay, let's go to MailChimp and let's take the email address that we've been fed and we'll go look to see if there's any email subscribers on my MailChimp lists that match this email address. And if so, we're going to pull in all the data that we have on that particular subscriber. So their names, the email address itself, any interest lists that you might be subscribed to, when you subscribed, when you're last updated, all sorts of information like that might be personally identifiable information. So it doesn't discriminate in terms of what information it pulls. It's going to pull all of it. Mm-hmm. And if for some reason you're like, you know what, I don't want to include something in that report, well, it's all being included at this time. And we can play around with filters and things like that. If there's certain information that doesn't need to be included, then we can work with that. But for now, I'm basically pulling in everything, and then it gives you a more complete picture and really a one-stop shop to download this export file. And then let's say you came back to me and said, you know what, I don't really want to continue doing business with you, and I want to have all of my information erased from your website and whatever services that you're using. Then it's the same kind of thing where it's that one-stop shop. I enter in your email address, I click erase, and it goes in and it'll erase. It'll unsubscribe you from MailChimp. It'll erase all the information or anonymize the information from like orders in WooCommerce mm-hmm. or the comments that you've left on the site and stuff like that. So really, it's more about, technically someone, yes, they could go to log into MailChimp and say, okay, does this person subscribe to my newsletter? And if they do, then, okay, now I have to find all the information on that person. I have to now figure out a way to get it to that person.
Right.
And it's kind of a pain to do that. So what this is just trying to do is simplify the whole process and make it so that way you don't really have to struggle with this data collection, run around to a dozen different services for that.
Gotcha. That's very cool. And so WordPress has you covered inside of WordPress, or at least WordPress core, right? WordPress
Sure.
has you covered. Like, I don't suspect that I don't suspect that this privacy tool will work for LearnDash right out of the box, because LearnDash has its own stuff and it probably needs to hook into the new privacy settings, right? But as far as WordPress core, they've got you covered. Your plugin has us covered for some number of third-party services that you're integrating with.
Correct, yeah.
And you mentioned something interesting there, right? So it'll go and anonymize data for orders, right? Because as far as if somebody buys something from me, I can't just straight up delete that order. I need that information for tax purposes, right?
Right.
This episode is also brought to you by MailPoet. If you build WordPress websites, you probably recommend a newsletter solution to your customers. Why not offer them a solution that is built right into the WordPress admin? The new MailPoet plugin offers just that. On top of that, they have a new newsletter designer that's easier to use than MailChimp's, and it only takes a few minutes to configure. Your customers will love it. MailPoet offers a free sending plan to ensure top-notch deliverability. And if your customers run into issues, the MailPoet support team offers free email and chat support. Classy. Save yourself time, make your customers happy. Try the new MailPoet today. Visit wordpress.org/plugins/MailPoet. That's wordpress.org/plugins/MailPoet. And now, back to the show. So I at least need, the state they're in, and how much they gave me, because if they bought it and they're in my state, I'm going to need to pay sales tax on that. So, with I'm not an accountant either, but from what I understand, from what my accountant has told me, I live in Pennsylvania. I am subject to sales tax even on digital goods. Therefore, I need to know how much money people from inside of my state paid to me.
Right. And one of the kind of caveats to the whole GDPR thing is that if you're obligated to keep certain information for other purposes, so for like legal purposes, like taxes and things like that, you might need to keep some of that information, even though it is technically personally identifiable information. The fact that that transaction took place, you still need to keep it, for a certain period of time. In each state and each, country might even be different in terms of what that time period might be, whether it's a year or several years or whatever. But so there's things like that. And if you are in certain industries, they might have certain pieces of information that they need to keep for a certain period of time. So I know a lot of people in the insurance industry, they have to keep certain information for certain periods of time. So, each industry and each situation is going to be a little bit different in terms of what can and can't be erased. This tool right now is basically a blanket. In terms of exporting the data, it'll export everything that it possibly can. In terms of erasing data, it tries to be a little bit smart about it. So like payment data, it integrates with Stripe, I mentioned before. Payment data, it's not necessarily just going to do a hard erase of that entire customer from your Stripe account, because you might need some sort of audit trail with that information.
Gotcha. And one more thought before we get on to, obviously this is new, so not a lot of changes have happened since launch, but I do want to ask about pricing and plans for the future. But I do want to point out here that as far as the United States goes, at least, it hasn't even launched yet, right? So at the time of this recording, this hasn't been tested in the courts of the United States, right? Part of me says maybe I should just let it ride and see. Google's going to be the first one to get sued, right, by the EU. And that'll set a legal precedent inside the United States. And then the other part of me reminds me that they are privy to 4% of my income as a fee if they determine that I break the rules of GDPR, right?
Well, it's actually technically whichever one is greater, 20 million euros or 4% of your last year's revenue. So
whichever one is greater.
Whichever one is greater.
That's impossible. So I can't pay that.
Up to. Right, sure. So, and they can use the crazy thing that I heard about this is, or read up about this, is that each country within the European Union has their own discretion in terms of how they're going to, enforce these rules and issue punishments or penalties or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, some of them could just be a warning. They could say, hey, you're not doing this right. Here's how you fix it. And I think that's going to probably be more along the lines of what the initial things are going to be, just because it is so new, and how you're going to deal with it. I think it's more going to be along the lines of, hey, we see you made an effort. You're not exactly doing it right. Here's what you can do to fix it. And I think that's probably going to be the way it goes. But again, like you said, this coming Friday hasn't happened yet, so I don't know how it's going to happen.
Well, yeah. Well, I'll tell you what. If they want 20 million euro from me, they're going to have to come to my house and take me, so they can deal with whatever they need to deal with for that.
Yeah, exactly.
But so I think that your plugin is very interesting. You mentioned that this is a premium plugin. I think there's a very obvious pricing model to me as far as it works. But why don't you talk about how are you deciding to price this?
Yeah. So I initially wanted to build out like a different plugin for each third-party service. So like a MailChimp plugin and a Stripe plugin and everything else. And then I started thinking about it. I'm in a mastermind group, and we kind of kicked around some ideas, and someone had mentioned, why not just build it all into one plugin and just sell that one plugin? And I started thinking about it, and at first I didn't want to do that because I was thinking, well, now I'm going to have all this code in the plugin that's not necessary for everyone to have. But at the same time, no one wants to install 15 different plugins to basically do the same thing. Right. And even from a marketing standpoint, even if I price each one of those plugins low, like, $5 or $10 or something like that, if someone had 15 or 20 different third-party services that they're integrating with, that $150 or $200 sale is going to be kind of a tougher pill to swallow than a one lower price that kind of covers them all. And so I figured from a marketing perspective, it would probably be easier to sell at a flat rate. Here's that one thing, and then any updates, you're going to get new integrations, for the duration of your license and whatnot. So, and I can play around with the pricing, as things come up. This is all brand new. It's just within the last couple of weeks was any of this even possible. Right. So, it's all kind of happened pretty quick. And so pricing is one of those things that I thought about along the way, but it wasn't like top of mind. It was more like I need to have a product to sell before I can even worry about pricing.
Right.
So that was kind of my, it was almost an afterthought, but not quite that bad. But the other nice thing about having everything in one plugin is that, if someone decides to switch to a competing service, so from MailChimp to ConvertKit or something else like that,
they're not wasting their money on the add-on, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So that, it's like, well, I got another 6 months left on this license, and then I'll have to get the other one. If everything's in the same one, it makes it much easier for them to just continue doing business the way they were going to do business anyways.
Yeah. Well, that's very thoughtful. It sounds like way more than an afterthought, because my initial thought was you have the core plugin and then you can pay for, maybe you pay for the newsletter add-on and the e-commerce add-on. But this, as a consumer, as somebody who will buy this plugin, I'm very grateful that it's not the case that, I'm going to have to pay individually for each integration. Because, a lot of us, especially developers, we're going to have a lot of integrations because we're testing different services and trying out stuff.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that it sounds like a lot of thought went into pricing, which is good. I've gotten a lot better at thinking about pricing, but it's always been like I'll just kind of feel my way through pricing right now. So you've put more thought into it than I have, and I think the important takeaway is that you're going to test it, right? Pricing's never set in stone.
Right.
It's generally easier to increase the price than decrease the price as far as doing right by your current customers, I've heard.
Sure. Yeah. And that's one thing I didn't want to have to do is, set it at a crazy price that I would then realize, well, no one's buying this and I'll got to come down. And then I'll have angry customers who didn't get it at the right price or whatever. And they're like, well, I need a refund for the difference or whatever.
Yeah. So, right. You have the one person who buys it at $99 and you're like, oh, it's not selling. I'm going to drop it to $49. I just paid $50 more than I had to. Right.
Exactly. Right. So, yeah, I'd like to avoid that at all costs and, try to keep people happy. This is supposed to make life easier and not be a headache. Right. So, that's hopefully what it's going to do. Awesome.
Well, we are, we're like right coming up on time. This is perfect. So before I ask you my title question, which you said you listened, so you know what it is.
Sure.
I do want to ask, what are your plans for the future? Do you have like a prioritized list of integrations? Do you want to do filtering next? What's next on your plate for post-launch?
Yeah, so one of the things I want to do is I definitely want to add new services. I don't have a ton in there right now. It was just more like I'm gonna check the box on a handful of integrations so I can have something out there and I can start getting some feedback. I'd like to have some sort of poll or survey or something like that on my site that people can vote on the different integrations, or they can add in their own integrations, and then people can vote on that type of thing. That's just one of those things that is added to the to-do list, and I have to figure out how to do that with still being GDPR compliant, because the last thing in the world I want to do with this is not be GDPR
right,
compliant.
You can email your customers as long as you have explicit opt-in consent to email your customers for polling it.
Exactly.
So, fantastic. Well, that sounds really good. I'm very excited to continue watching the development of this plugin, especially as WordPress evolves and GDPR starts to be implemented and kind of the ramifications for that. And so I do want to ask you, do you have any trade secrets for us?
Yeah, so I don't know if this is really a trade secret or not, or just generally good advice, but I like like to make sure that people are taking care of themselves, both not just physically taking care of themselves, but also mentally taking care of themselves. The last few weeks, kind of working on this project, has kind of reconfirmed that one of the best things that I can do for myself and my code is to get a good night's sleep. I can't tell you how many times I've stared at the computer for a long time, just struggling to figure something out when something wasn't working. When I was tired, later at night or whatever. And then 9 times out of 10, I come back the next morning and I figure it out in about 10 minutes. Meanwhile, I wasted all that time the night before spinning my wheels, and I could have spent my time, doing anything else. Right. I could hang out with my family, or, even just watching TV and letting my brain, melt or whatever, But also, exercise is super important too. I feel that as developers, we tend to sit behind desks for long periods of time and drink tons of coffee or whatever our caffeinated beverage of choice is. And if you're feeling sluggish in the morning, do some exercise. You don't need to go to the gym. And actually, I think going to the gym is sort of an excuse to not do exercise, because there's always that extra step that you have to take just to get there. So then the weather or car trouble or time or whatever becomes the excuse for not going to the gym. Just do some push-ups or sit-ups or jumping jacks or go for a jog or whatever. And so, so I don't know if that's necessarily a trade secret, but it's what I use. So.
It's great advice, and also a little bit counter, right? I don't want to take anything away from Gary Vaynerchuk, Gary V, the hustle master. He's obviously way more successful than I am, but he gives some of the worst advice, like in his last book. He said, if you have a full-time job, come home from your full-time job and work 7 to 2, or if you have a family, 9 to 3. I'm like, I have a 14-month-old. I'm not working like 7 a.m. when I get up with my baby, which is generous of her to sleep that long.
Right.
Till 7 in the morning, or till 3 in the morning, and then do the whole thing again in 4 hours or 5 hours? Like, that's obnoxious. So get sleep, get rest. You'll be a lot better for it. And
absolutely.
Going to the gym, the barrier for working out is definitely one that rings true for me. I always just kind of viewed my Planet Fitness subscription as like a fat tax, but now I've got 2 apps for my phone that are great. One is called Carrot Fitness. It's like 7-minute workouts. It's awesome. And I have a subscription to Fight Camp. Have you heard of Fight Camp?
I have heard of it. I haven't checked it out yet, but I've heard of it.
It's great. Yeah. They're like boxing lessons that ranging from 15 to 45 minutes, and they just stream them to your phone. They send you punch trackers. So I'm learning how to box, and I'm closing my exercise ring and my movement ring on my Apple Watch before I even start my day, really. So
that's great.
So if you want to work out at home, if you want to heed Scott's advice, which I recommend you do, those are 2 apps. I'll link them in the show notes for you to check out. Scott, thanks so much for joining me today. Where can people find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I'm on there quite a bit at Scott DeLuzio, ScottDeluzio, or my personal site, scottdeluzio.com. And you can find more about PrivacyWP at privacywp.com. I'm not very creative with the names like that, but it helps people find.
Those are the best names. I know exactly. That's the Pippin's plugins approach, right? You know exactly what you're getting. So I'll link all of that and more in the show notes. Scott, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Lots of information that we're taking in there, but only with your consent, of course. I think Scott was able to highlight a few of the important bits about GDPR and how we can ease the transition with his plugin. You should definitely check it out if you use WordPress. And just another reminder that we are not lawyers, so if you do need some consultation, you should ask a lawyer. As a matter of fact, in the show notes, I'm going to link to Ryan Kinney's episode. She is a fantastic lawyer who understands law in the digital space. And thanks again to our sponsors, Pantheon and MailPoet. Definitely check them out. They both have free offerings for you to try. So MailPoet is free on the WordPress plugin repository, and Pantheon gives you an account for free until you are ready to make your site live. For all of the show notes, head over to howibuilt.it/83. If you like the show, head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and a review. It really helps people discover us, and I've got to say, you guys have been doing great. The show has seen a lot of fantastic growth over the last few months, in part due to the added ratings and reviews. If you want to support the show directly, you can go to patreon.com/howibuiltit and pledge as little as $1 a month for some great content. If you're not quite there yet, you could always join the free Facebook community over at howibuilt.it/Facebook. Thanks for joining me, and until next week, get out there and build something.